So we're going to talk about Esther 2 and 3 today and tomorrow. Then I can see where I'm reading. And you can follow along in your outline. So as we begin chapter 2, new characters are introduced in these chapters. Only Xerxes is left from chapter 1. And we meet Mordecai and Esther, also known as Hadassah, and Haman in these chapters. Now, I just want to give you a quick background, a quick review of chapter 1. Vashti, queen of Persia, is deposed, and the concept of a new queen is proposed, a better queen. Presumably that means more obedient. But no details are hammered out. Exactly how this new queen would become queen isn't discussed in chapter 1. Chapter 1 also serves as a kind of a character study of King Xerxes. We see that King Xerxes is easily manipulated. We'll see that again. He's egomaniacal. He is very egotistic. He's impetuous. He doesn't think before acting. And he uses people for his own purposes. We also get a picture of Xerxes' kingdom at the zenith, at the high point of his reign. In fact, we read that it said that this party he was giving displayed the splendor and glory of his majesty. So it's giving us a picture of his powerful kingdom. And then it's also showing us the vastness of Xerxes' kingdom. Now, here's what's unwritten. Here's the unwritten background. Between chapters 1 and 2, Xerxes suffered a stunning and embarrassing defeat against the upstart Greeks. That's the battle for which the recruiting party in chapter 1 was held, right? That's why he was having that recruiting party, to help him win that battle, but he lost it embarrassingly. So the point of chapter 1 is to paint a picture of a king and a kingdom, to set the stage for the story of Esther and Mordecai, and to give us a glimpse of what they will be up against within the Persian court. So a proposal is made in Esther 2, verses 1 through 4. After these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus had abated, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, "Let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa, the citadel capital, under custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti." This pleased the king, and he did so. So here's the proposal. And by the way, you thought the show The Bachelor was a new concept? No, it's not. And can I also say, what about the ugly young virgins? I'm pretty sure they were never so happy to be ugly at this time. So here was the normal procedure of a king finding a wife. They would choose wives from the families of nobles. So from the best families, they would choose a wife. That was typical. Now, this is very highly unusual. But although it's unusual, it wasn't unheard of for the king to find a wife outside of the nobility. It did happen from time to time. So you see this word in Scripture quite a bit, concubines. Concubines are a harem. They're women that are at the man's disposal that are not his wife or wives. And Persians had many concubines. They came to the harem as virgins, and they lived in what Karen Jobes called luxurious desolation after sleeping with the king. They could not return home or marry or have families of their own. That would also be the fate of the women rounded up for the new Queen Beauty. And again, in these verses, we see the manipulation of Xerxes. Again, the king is told what is in his own best interest. Again, he is easily manipulated and doesn't seem to think things through. In other words, for the second time in 2 chapters, people other than the king are dictating what the king will decree. I think the author is mocking the king. And then in verses 5 through 7, Mordecai and Esther are introduced. First with Mordecai. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. Now, in the Bible, in ancient writing in general, but in the Bible, the first thing we learn about someone is important. What is the first thing that we learn about Mordecai? He's a Jew. The first thing we learn is that he's a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin and a descendant of Kish. He's not the son of Kish. He's a descendant of Kish. That's what son of means. Now, why is that important? Well, King Saul's father's name was Kish. And perhaps that this Kish is Saul's father. And this possibility will take on added significance in the next chapter. Now, it says that Mordecai was taken into Jerusalem, that he was, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah, king of Judah. Now, here's the thing. If that were so, if he actually was part of the exile, he would be over 100 years old at this point. So I don't think he was actually part of the exile. But the author is making a point. The author says it this way to make a point. And here's the point the author's making. He's identifying Mordecai with the people of God, the children of God's covenant. And this is a very Jewish way of thinking, that when the people of Judah were taken into Israel, or taken into exile, all of God's people were taken into exile, even those yet to be born. So I think the author here is associating Mordecai with the exile and therefore God's people, even though he was almost certainly born in Persia. He was in exile along with the rest of God's people. And he is still one of God's dispersed and displaced people. In chapter 7, we meet Esther. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at. And when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. So Esther has 2 names. Hadassah is her Hebrew name, and that is a Hebrew name. If you know who Joe Lieberman is, He was a senator, and he was the vice presidential candidate for Al Gore. He didn't ever become vice president, but and his wife's name is Hadassah, so it is a Hebrew name. Her Persian name was Esther, which means star. Her Persian name may have been a transliteration of Hadassah. We don't know that for sure. But some ancient Jewish writings suggest that Esther was a nickname given to her by the people, by the Persian people. She was a star. It's interesting, though, that Esther is the only person in this story with two names. And she will be the one that has to decide to which people does she belong. Is she Persian Esther, or is she Jewish Hadassah? She's also Mordecai's cousin, but he's a father figure. He raised her. She was raised by him. And again, the emphasis is on her beauty, just as it was with Vashti. So the edict is carried out. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Agagite, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Agagite, who had charge of the women. And the young woman pleased him. Esther pleased him and won his favor, and he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So it tells us that Esther was taken. Interesting language. Was it against her will? How did she feel about it? It's impossible to say. The author doesn't tell us. But the author may be suggesting that she and the rest of the people in this story are caught up in events that they cannot control. Events that are being controlled by some unseen force, meaning God. And in that case, honestly, her personal feelings are somewhat irrelevant. But she wins favor, again. No doubt due in part, at least, to her beauty. And she conceals her identity as a Jew. Think about that. That would have almost certainly forced Esther to break the Jewish law. How do you keep dietary laws in a harem? How do you celebrate and keep the Sabbath? How do you do any of the feasts? Whether that's the Feast of Tabernacles or Passover. Thank you. I passed over that. How do you celebrate that? Now, Mordecai tells her to conceal her Jewish identity. What motivated him to tell her that? The author doesn't say. Was it a good thing or a bad thing for them to conceal their identity? The author doesn't say. Did Mordecai fear anti-Semitism in the court? Possible, but the author doesn't say. It does tell us that he checked on her daily. And that's a possible indication of anti-Semitism, but it's not an outright statement of it. Mordecai had some position in the royal court. We'll talk more about that in a minute. But he too, at least to this point, may have concealed his Jewish identity. At the very least, they had both so assimilated into the culture that they could conceal their identity. The way they had lived concealed their identity. And we see ambiguity again. Again, the author leaves us to make our own inferences. Were their actions good or bad? How did they feel about the situation? Why did they do what they did? For the most part, we just aren't told. And the author neither condemns nor justifies their actions, just relates them. Here's what Aaron Job says about this. It is natural to pass judgment on these two, Mordecai and Esther, whether positive or negative, but in doing so, we may miss an important point. This deliberate silence is part of the message. Regardless of their character, their motives, or their fidelity to God's law, the decisions Esther and Mordecai make move events in some inscrutable way to fulfill the covenant promises God made to his people long ago. Dr. Lindegood says this. Here is hope for all of those who find themselves in difficult circumstances in the present because of their past sin and compromise. Perhaps he has brought us to where we are today so that we can serve him in a unique way. If so, that doesn't make those wrong decisions and sinful actions right, but it should cause us to give thanks to God that he is able to form beautiful pictures out of our smudged and stained efforts. Past failures do not write us out of a significant part in God's script for the future. So regardless of Esther's motivation, Mordecai's motivation, or decisions, whether they're good or bad, God is working. He's working in and through their decisions to fulfill his purposes and work out his plan. And he does the same through our motivations and decisions, good, bad, and otherwise. Well, this is real world stuff. We all fall down, we all screw up, but we cannot derail God's plan. That should comfort us. It's not a license to screw up. It should comfort us. God will work out his plans in our lives. I think that's worth giving him praise. Hallelujah. And so then we get to the pageant rules. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of beautified, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and ointments for women. When the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, the harem where they were no longer virgins, in custody of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So the women were to do these beauty treatments with lotions and oils and spices, 6 months, a year of it. Seems a little over the top, but beautifying yourself for a year. It reminds me of a saying my mother used often. My mother did everything lavishly. She didn't do anything halfway. And she liked to say anything worth doing is worth overdoing. So this is kind of overdone. So in fact, this has kind of been corroborated by, because it says that was the normal thing to do by archaeology. They found cosmetic burners and other beautifying things in what was ancient Persia in archaeological digs. So they were given anything they wanted. The women were given anything they wanted, which is vague, but it probably means jewelry and clothing. She was allowed to go shopping before the big night. Likely she was allowed to keep these things, yippee. And afterward, she was returned to the harem and stayed there for life, living in luxury to be sure, but separated from family with no chance of marrying or having a family of her own. And then Esther's turn comes. When the turn came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Agagite, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her, and when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, The king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also granted removal of taxes to the provinces, and gave gifts with royal generosity. So again, we're told that Esther is taken into this. And again, we don't know her feelings. But it suggests that the situation is beyond her control anyway. She wins the heart of Xerxes. Her beauty is mentioned again. And she is made queen. Although the word marriage is never used, it's implied. You know, before I taught this many years ago now, for the first time, I never gave this situation much thought. You're just taught the story of Esther, and they leave out some significant details. Yes, right? And I always thought of Esther as this heroine. But is this the example I would want to hold up to my daughter or any of you in this room that are young women? No, not at all. And certainly what's happening here is a complete violation of the law that God gave to the Israelites, which tends us to help us to think about God's will in it. Was she in God's will or not? Is she a role model or not? The author doesn't hold her up as a role model, especially not here. But what we have here is a morally messy situation. And that's the way life often is, isn't it? We are often caught in difficult situations, sometimes of our own making, where there is no perfect choice. And simplistic moral judgments, while easy to make, are not always helpful. This episode from Esther's life offers great encouragement and comfort when we find ourselves in situations where every choice is an odd mix of right and wrong. Only God knows the end of our story from its beginning. We are responsible to Him for living faithfully in obedience to His word in every situation as best we know how. Even if we make the wrong decision, whether through innocent blunder or deliberate disobedience, our God is so gracious and omnipotent that He is able to use that weak link in a chain of events that will perfect His purposes in us and through us. So then we find Mordecai. Now, I'm not going to read this next part, but I'm going to tell you that Mordecai foils an assassination attempt on Xerxes' life. And it tells us that he was sitting at the king's gate, which meant he had some sort of official capacity, whether it was business or law or something like that. And two of the king's guards were plotting an assassination. He took it to Esther, who took it to the king, and the guys were murdered, and then it's dropped. The whole thing is just dropped, and the story takes a sharp turn. Here's what it says in Esther 3. After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman. For the king had so commanded concerning him. It was a law that you were to bow down to Haman. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day, and he would not listen to them, they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. So sometime later, we don't know how long, it may have been as much as 5 years, Haman is promoted to the highest person in the land except for Xerxes. Second in command, if you will. And just when we would have expected it to be Mordecai, he should have been rewarded for saving the king's life, but nothing happened. And again, we see Haman and Xerxes demanding respect again. What's the first thing we learn about Haman? He's an Agagite. He was an Agagite. And Agag was the king of the Amalekites. And the Amalekites were the first to attack Israel after they left Egypt. And they had many battles. In fact, there was a battle between Saul and the Amalekites. And God said, wipe all of them out. And he left some of the best animals and Agag alive. And I think it was Nathan, but I can't remember if it was Nathan or if it was Samuel. Samuel says, why have you left him alive? And he kills Agag. But Saul left Agag alive long enough to have more progeny. Kids, by the way. And so Agagite became a term that was used for Israel's enemies. And Agagite was an enemy of Israel. And I think what the author is doing here is intentional. He's setting up a battle between the descendant of Saul, Kish, Mordecai, and the descendant of Agag, Haman. Because Mordecai refuses to bow. Why? Why did he refuse to bow? It doesn't tell us. Maybe he was upset that he wasn't promoted. Maybe he just didn't like Haman. He was an unlikable guy for sure. But the inference of the author is that Mordecai is Jewish and Haman is an enemy of the Jews. Mordecai could tolerate bowing to Xerxes, but not this Agagite. It's possible that up to this point, Mordecai had concealed his own Jewish identity because it says that Mordecai had told these people at the gate that he was a Jew. The first time he told them that, it sounds like. So Haman is furious. Oh, I already did that. Okay. Hang on. I got it right here. I'll read it out of here. I don't know why that's not up here. Now it's 3. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, but he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. So Haman is livid, to say the least. And it's not enough to just get rid of Mordecai. Haman is bent on genocide. And again, we see an incident between two people being escalated to empire-wide proportions. And so the people, or Haman casts lots to determine when this annihilation would take place. It tells us that in verse 7. I'm not going to read that. So here's 5 and 6 is out of place. Here's a picture. It says here, in the first month, which is the month of Nissan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast Purim. That's where it gets its name. That is, they cast lots before Haman day after day, and they cast it month after month until the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. And this is what a lot looks like. A lot was a method of divination, if you will, of what the gods wanted in pagan religions. But the Jews also cast lots at times, and that was a way of determining God's will, of discerning God's will. The Israelites did it. And the lot fell to the 12th month, which was 11 months later. So this isn't going to happen for 11 months. But Haman must have been pretty sure of his success to cast a lot before securing the blessing of Xerxes for his plot. So here we see him manipulating Xerxes again. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, into the coffers, into the treasury, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you. The people also," meaning you can go ahead and kill all those people, "do with them as it seems good to you." So again, someone is telling the king what is in his best interest. And again, the king is so easily manipulated that he asks no questions and he doesn't even deliberate. He just follows Haman blindly. Notice that Haman never names the people, and Xerxes doesn't ask. There is a people. Never names them. Notice that Haman claims that these people are rampant lawbreakers, when really the only law that's being broken is bowing to Haman. And the only person defying it is Mordecai. Notice also that he appeals to Xerxes' depleted treasury. Warmongering is very expensive, and so he could have used the money. And 10,000 talents was a huge sum. The annual income from tax money in the Persian Empire was 14 to 15,000 talents. So 10 talents is a whole bunch of money. And presumably that money would come from plundering the Jews when they defeated them. It may have been an exaggerated figure anyway, but it was a huge sum. And the king just hands Haman his ring and says, "Do what you wish." And he did. He wrote a law. No, we'll stop here. We'll pick up here tomorrow. That's okay. I can't get through it. It'll be short, and then I'll talk to the freshmen.